today we're making tonkatsu, a Japanese dish that is delicious and a mainstay in Korea. It really is pretty simple, so let's get into it. The first thing we have to do is get some boneless pork chops. My pork chops were vacuum packed in its own juices, so I had to dry it off. Apparently this drying off process also gets rid of the unwanted pork smell. Don't know how true that is, but yeah, dry off the pork. Next up is trimming the fat. I believe this pork chop is cut in a New York pork chop style, and they usually leave some fat on the edges. I don't really like fat, so cutting it off is the way to go. Also, we are frying this, so I don't think we need any more fat. But yeah, along the edges, just cut the fat. Next up is to butterfly the pork chops. Lay the pork chops on their sides and place your non-knife hand on top and then cut it in the middle. It doesn't need to be exactly in the middle, but ideally, since we're going to be frying all these pork chops for the same amount, having them similar in shape will allow for even cooking. Once all the pork has been butterflied, it's time to hammer the pork. I do it to flatten it out and make it thin. Tenderizing is just a plus. But I know in like Japan, there are like tonkatsu spots where they have their tonkatsus where they're like an inch thick. But I prefer it to be a bit thinner. Well, let's say this, thicker than a schnitzel, but thinner than those 1 inches on Instagram. Also, put a plastic film over it so you don't have pork flying all over the place. Now, it's time to season the pork. For the first pork, season the cutting board with garlic powder, black pepper, and flour. The flour is for the egg wash. Once that is done, place the pork on top of it. Then, we just layer it up. Garlic powder, black pepper, and flour, then pork. Then the seasonings again. Essentially, we're making a pork lasagna. But in all seriousness, doing it this way saves you on the amount of seasoning you use and keeps everything relatively clean. Now that we have prepared the pork, it is time to heat up the oil. I'm using avocado oil, but any neutral oil is fine. While your oil is heating, it's time for the egg wash. I'm going to crack 5 eggs because I have a decent amount of pork, but crack appropriately. Once cracked, scramble the eggs. The final step is to get the breadcrumbs. I'm using Panko. You can use regular breadcrumbs, but for it to taste like a tonkatsu and not like a schnitzel, I think Panko is required. I usually just pour it on the same cutting board I used to cut the pork. I don't think there's a need to dirty an extra dish. I would suggest always pouring a conservative amount the first time because you can always pour more later. Now, it's time to actually start making the tonkatsu. Since we already have floured the pork, we can just dip it into the egg wash right away. Make sure everything is submerged, then take it out and put it onto the breadcrumbs. The corners where your fingers are holding the pork usually don't get any breadcrumbs on them, so make sure you get those spots as well. Once you have egged and coated your pork with breadcrumbs, it's time to fry. You will know the oil is at the temperature if you drop some panko into the oil and you see it fizzle. In terms of how long you fry a centimeter thick tonkatsu, I would say 6 minutes. Just make sure at the 3-minute mark you flip it. And with that, fry away. This is a relatively easy dish with little preparation, although it does get a bit messy. However, if you live in the US like me, there aren't really restaurants that serve good tonkatsu. Also, if they do, they just charge an insane amount. Like, my one gripe with these Japanese restaurants in the States is that they charge an inordinate amount because it's supposed to be quote-unquote fancy. But coming from Korea, most of the dishes served at those restaurants are not even close to those prices. Anyways, rant done. Also, if you're looking at your screen, you probably noticed there's something else in the oil, and that's just mandu. If you have frozen mandu or dumplings in your freezer, this is a great time to cook them up since you already are frying something up, so yeah, for the efficiency. Also, besides efficiency, they taste real good. Now, back to the tonkatsu. After 6 minutes, pull them out and let them rest for a couple of minutes. During this time, you can get a strainer and strain the particulates out of the oil. This is just to ensure a cleaner frying environment. Once that is done, fry the tonkatsu again. This just ensures a crispier exterior. The second fry only takes around 4 minutes, so just 2 minutes per side. And with that, you're done with your tonkatsu. Usually you can have tonkatsu with rice, but you can also have them with some udon noodles. I prefer rice, gaktogi, and some doenjang when eating tonkatsu. I think that's just the perfect match. Some soup and some fried food and some rice to cut through the oiliness. And with that, just cut the tonkatsu into long sticks and you're ready to go. In terms of the cutting motion, I suggest one confident slice. If you start sawing back and forth, the coating just falls apart. In the end, tonkatsu is an easy weeknight meal. It has a crispy exterior from the fried panko and a juicy interior from the pork. And yes, you can use chicken instead of pork for my non-pork eaters. But yeah, try it out, it's pretty good.